Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Meredith Preston-McGee. I'm the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism, coming to you today from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I wanted to, before I dive into this extraordinary conversation that we'll have with these two exceptional gentlemen, I wanted to say a few words about pluralism and how we define these concepts, as I think that this will be helpful in framing the conversation that we're going to be having with Naheed Nenshi and Jesse Wente today. The Global Center for Pluralism, as many of you know, was founded as a joint initiative between His Highness the Aga Khan and the Government of Canada. The center was founded on the belief that societies thrive when differences are valued. We believe that embracing diversity as a strength is central for sustainable, successful, and importantly, peaceful societies. And we all know that diversity in all of our societies, all of our communities, and our nations is a demographic fact. Our differences may differ, but the fact that we have differences is truly universal. But how we respond to those differences is a choice and an action. And pluralism expects us to take actions, positive actions, to respond to diversity, to see it as a strength in our societies rather than as a threat, something to be managed or indeed violently suppressed. This requires us to think differently about how we react as a society, how we talk about issues in our society, and how we understand power dynamics, exclusion, and so many other issues. Pluralism can be understood by looking at the connection of two kind of core elements in our societies. The structural, the institutional responses to difference, our laws, our policies, our systems, and our social cultural responses, the narratives about belonging, the stories that we tell our children, how we frame our histories, and how we understand events that are happening all around us. We at the center think about these things as the hardware and software of pluralism. Laws are a product of our social norms, our views on difference, our views on belonging. And in turn, our systems influence how we see the world, how our social norms are expressed or suppressed, how our responses to difference take place. And we need to engage both the hardware and the software. So pluralism really requires transformation. It requires that we don't imagine that we're pulling up an extra seat to a table and inviting those who've been traditionally excluded on our own terms, but really rather trying to have a connection, a conversation on how collectively we should all be transforming and developing a new table, essentially redesigning it over time. And this requires us to have uncomfortable conversations about the power structures in our society, about the systemic elements that have advantaged one group over another, sought to exclude, or indeed to exterminate. These are difficult discussions, but really critically important for our social progress. And within all of this, allyship is incredibly important as a concept. You know, pluralism requires an all of society effort. It's not just the responsibility of the excluded. It requires these collective responses. I spent 20 years working as a peacemaker across primarily East and the Horn of Africa before returning to Canada to take on this role. And for decades, we saw that it was excluded voices from the peace process who were constantly pushing to be in the room to transform the table. And very, very rarely was anyone who was already in the room reimagining that table to recognize that inclusion was really elemental to the entire success of that social project of making peace. And so for me, this allyship discussion today really resonates with peace processes and peacemaking around the world, and certainly with our journey for peacemaking here in Canada. So with that said, I'm really thrilled, Jesse and Naheed, to have you with us today for this discussion. I will sort of briefly introduce, but not really introduce either of you. His Worship, former Mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi, and the Chair of the Canada Council of the Arts and member of the Serpent River First Nation, Mr. Jesse Wente. It's really such a pleasure to be in conversation with both of you today. I am not going to try and do justice to either of your biographies. I feel sometimes that our biographies can be reductive in terms of what they really say about us. They're sort of a list of things we've done rather than who we are as people. So I thought I would start with an opening question that maybe gives you a chance to reflect a little bit on your own experiences, and through that we'll get to know you a little bit. So Nahid, if I can turn to you first, I would really love if you could reflect, after more than 10 years as mayor, how you perceive Canada and Canadians. We make great claims to be inclusive, diverse, and tolerant as a society. So are we?
Well, thanks very much, Meredith, for that very small question to get us started off. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, Jesse. It's a real pleasure to meet you virtually through this format, and I'm really looking forward to this dialogue. I'm coming to you today from my fully equipped home studio, otherwise known as my dining room, because no one's allowed to come for dinner, here on a very ancient land, a land where people have been gathering for thousands of years. The original inhabitants of this land are Nitsitapi, the people. Nowadays, we call them the people of the Blackfoot Confederacy, joined here by the Mountain people, the Ahi Nakota people, and our neighbors, the Beaver people, the Tsuut'ina Nation. Calgary has, for 150 years or so, been a gathering point where these two rivers come together in this place the Blackfoot call Mohkinstsis. And we gathered people from all over the world to this land with a very simple promise that this is a place where you'll be safe, where you're welcome, where your kids and their kids and their kids will have tremendous opportunity. And when I think about my role over the last 10 years, I think of it in the terms of that little promise. Are we continuing to create a place of opportunity, of dignity, and of prosperity for everyone? And I've tried to think about all of the issues that we've dealt with at the city through that lens. And lately, I've been thinking a lot about kind of the core issues that are facing Canada today. I think there are 5 simultaneous crises going on, any one of which could bring us to our knees. The first, of course, is public health, pandemic. The second is mental health and addiction. The third is a climate crisis, an environmental crisis. The fourth is an economic crisis, where we're trying to redefine what it means for everyone to have dignified work. But I think that all of these are underpinned by a real reckoning on the issue of equity, which really comes to the question that you're asking, Meredith. You know, last summer, at the height of the Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter movements, here in Calgary, we had an unprecedented thing, which is we opened up City Hall for people to come and just tell us their stories. And listening to those stories was challenging for me. As someone who's been active in the anti-racist space, as someone who's been active in the work we're doing in our community on reconciliation, though my friend Elder Casey Eagle Speaker told me that summer, stop saying the word reconciliation. I don't want to hear that you say that word anymore. I want you to hear you talk about reconciliation. What are you doing about it? And even as someone who's been working in this space so much, I found myself simultaneously surprised and not surprised by the stories I was hearing. I was not surprised because, frankly, none of the stories were new. But I forced myself to be surprised by saying to myself, you know what? I'm old now. And if 20-year-olds today are telling me the stories of the casual racism they experienced in our community, which were the same as when I was 20 years old, then how do we manage that? And the thrust of your question, Meredith, is really critical in my own mind. I spent my entire life talking about how great Canada is, how great Calgary is, how we are an exemplar for the world on issues of diversity, pluralism, multiculturalism. I often brag about the fact that the Global Center for Pluralism is in Canada. I talk about the fact that I was on the jury for the Global Pluralism Award precisely because I'm a Canadian. And it was important to have a Canadian voice other than the chair on that jury. So how do I reconcile the fact that I am, I think, rightfully proud of what we built here, that I believe that the world, if it exemplified and honored what we do in Canada, would be a far better place, with the fact that we are not yet a place that is truly anti-racist, that we have enormous work to go on that journey. And I don't know actually what that destination looks like. I'm not even sure what the journey is, but I know we have to commit to it, and we have to commit to doing something even better. And particularly when we think about the whole issue of reconciliation with Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, I often say we are at the sharp, pointy end of the stick of reconciliation. that making the gestures, doing the land acknowledgements is important. Don't get me wrong, it's symbolic and it's important. But we run the risk of it becoming kind of rote. People doing land acknowledgements like they're reciting grace before dinner, not realizing, I heard a comedian say, you're Canadian because you will give an incredibly earnest land acknowledgement before commencing anything and then just go on with what you were doing anyway. And to me, I think that when we give that acknowledgement, it's a reminder not of the dusty past, but it's a statement of intention about the future that we're trying to build together. And that's not going to be easy. There has to come times of difficult negotiation over difficult issues. That's why I call it the pointy end of the stick. But it has to be done with open hearts, open minds, and a real focus on how we build prosperity for everyone. And that, I think, is probably the biggest challenge. And when I talk, finally, I'll just wrap up by saying, when I talk about that issue of equity underpinning everything else, I'm talking about gender equity, I'm talking about income equity, which is very unpopular to talk about these days. I'm talking about anti-racism, and I'm talking about reconciliation. But of those, I really believe that the movement towards anti-racism, the movement towards reconciliation, are what are going to define us as a nation in the near future.
And what will underpin progress on so many of the other issues that you're talking about as well. Yeah, Naheed, thank you. Jesse, if I can turn to you now, you reflect on so many issues about identity and belonging in Unreconciled in your recent book. I was wondering if you could start by reflecting on your own experience growing up and what this can sort of make us think differently about in terms of identity and belonging as we talk about all of these issues.
Yes, thank you so much, Meredith, and thank you, Naheed, for that very thoughtful answer. I guess what I would say is that, my journey is probably not dissimilar to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, especially maybe particularly for those of us who grew up in the city or away from our traditional territories or homelands and our communities, is to beginning to understand that identity and belonging, especially for certain communities, has been a point of attack for that. Part of what colonialism does is to attack those connections and to impede those reconnections. And that really part of my journey is beginning, and I say this as a middle-aged man now, has come to understand that it's really about reconnecting to who I am as an Anishinaabe person and undoing a lot of what we are all conditioned under these, not just in Canada, I would say, particularly in any states that are the product of European colonialism of 500 years ago, which is a not insignificant amount of the world. That those very things, particularly for Indigenous people, for Black people, for racialized people, are have been made challenging intentionally, and at the same time, the identities for those that actually identify more with states than they do with community. So those people who might actually say, I'm American or I'm Canadian, as opposed to because these are very recent ideas, American and Canadian. And so it's interesting to see so many pin their identities on those ideas, that I think may have meant that many of us are searching to understand belonging and identity, and that that is something that we reconcile on our own. We will need to reconcile communally, and I think it plays a role in part of what reconciliation is writ large. And I'm pretty challenged with that word these days. I particularly don't like separating it from truth, because I think it then makes it very easy to manipulate that word to rob it of any actual tangible meaning. And I think we see that a lot, where people will speak of reconciliation but not mention truth. And I think that is intentional. intentional to shift goalposts to make it obscure what we're actually doing. And so to be specific, there's the TRC, which was pretty specific mandate towards residential schools and laid out a pretty specific 94 steps of how one might resolve that specific issue. Likewise, we had the report of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which had, I believe, 213 calls for justice. Again, fairly narrow mandate, issued a fairly specific remedies to what it would see. But I think what I think I sense in so many questions about where we are in reconciliation is actually not being specific about either of those issues. It's more about a grander sense of reconciling what, if I'm honest, is colonialism. And I do think that is, I don't think I think we're going to be challenged to do that. I think even, you know, in the way we frame, and I don't disagree with what Naheed said about, you know, those priorities. I think if we were to truly decolonize our approach to those issues, we might have better solutions than if we approach them in the same understanding and systems that frankly helped create the disparity that we already see. And I think that is a challenge we're seeing in Canada, in local and national economies, in the shifts away from these things, and truly being able to embrace the idea that we have to do big things very differently, not just the small things. It actually requires not just systems change, but frankly, a pretty grand philosophical shift. And I hope that some of that identity and belonging work that I think is really about personal decolonization, of unwrapping the conditioning and so much of how we view ourselves and understand ourselves within this larger context, that we can then transform those systems. But it's a lot of work that has to be done. It's a generational project, and the urgency for all, again, if we look at those 5 stressors that Naheed, I think, correctly pointed at, those are crises. That's not just these might be trouble areas. I mean, I would say those are 5 things where we are actually fairly deep into crisis, and the systems that we've built, I think the judgment on how well they've done in these crises is a pretty harsh one. And that's why we really do need to look at unpacking all of that. And I know I drifted a bit from the identity and belonging answer, but I don't think it's disconnected, frankly, from these larger issues. I think so much of our humanity is a bit adrift because of these systems have made us to drift. They want us to do this, and we need to reground ourselves in order to actually face what we have, because these aren't existential crises anymore. These are here. We are living in them.
And we need to recognize that all of us are living in them. Even those people that feel less affected are implicated and need to really act. And, you know, Jesse, if I could just stay with you for a minute, your points on the truth and reconciliation process, I think, are so important. And I really saw so many times as a peacemaker around the world that opportunities got lost, and that actions undermined even after things as important as the TRC and the Commission on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, that you saw then other actions undermined the progress that got made in some of those moments. And so, you know, thinking that as we're having this conversation here, we're seeing the violence on the Wet'suwet'en territory right now is an expression of what you describe as that system response to these issues, and is sort of the inverse of what we would think about as a pluralistic response to difference and to these spaces in our society. And so I was wondering if you just might want to reflect a little bit further on not just on that particular moment that we're in, but also for those of us non-Indigenous Canadians watching this. how should people act, react, engage with these events in these moments, as well as with this wider process? I know that's a huge question, but I think your reflections on that would be really valuable.
Sure. Well, I guess I would start by paraphrasing Lee Marikal, who just recently passed and was one of our great thinkers and writers and leaders. And what she said in response to a very similar question was, I have a lot of space for forgiveness for someone who has stepped on my foot, but how am I to forgive if you're still standing on my feet? Mm. And I think the reflection point when we see things like what's happening in Wet'suwet'en and not just there. I mean, this is a global thing. If we look elsewhere, not just in Canada, and frankly, if we understand that part of that legacy is Canadian, that it is global. Mm-hmm. Some of this behavior, we are just creating, or Canada is just creating the need to further reconciliation. That all this will require is that it means our children will have to continue this process, and that we aren't going to get as far along as we can. And I do think just from and I understand how complex these issues are. But I also can understand the simplicity of removing Indigenous people to force a private company's oil pipeline through during a climate crisis while the literal province you're in seems to be sinking into the ocean. I mean, that seems, I don't know how to phrase it other than that. That seems out of step with any logic I can grasp as a human. But I understand that there's, I want to leave space for it, but I think it really does challenge these notions. And what I would also urge people to understand is from First Nations perspective, it is very frustrating, perhaps damningly so, that what we see so often in the response is a jurisdictional debate over whose responsibility these things are. And I guess I would ask, from our point of view, why would we care which colonial government is responsible for this exactly? Why is that our business at all? And I say this as a member of a nation whose treaty we signed predates this country and was signed with a monarchy across the ocean who doesn't pay much attention to the treaty it signed over here, and who never agreed to be ruled by this place that now exists. It's a struggle for me to comprehend how we think we're actually going to progress. And this speaks to the very thing I was talking about, which is the solution does not lie in doing the same thing over and over again. That is unimaginable to me, that we can even comprehend or argue that is even on any basis true. We have all sorts of history and evidence to show that it is false, that we have to change how we do things in order to change our circumstances and our relationships. So I think, from my perspective, there's been a lot of opportunity for this outcome to have been avoided. And it's disappointing that those steps weren't taken, and that those relationships weren't built up to avoid these situations, and that it makes it hard for the rest of us, all of whom our communities are familiar with these struggles, because whether they happen tomorrow or whether they happened 150 years ago, we are very familiar with these exact issues. If reconciliation is about rebuilding a relationship, I guess I would ask people to imagine, how do you think we would go about that given those actions? And that is why I think you hear youth questioning. And I guess I would also say, as you sort of mentioned off the top, it is not Indigenous people's responsibility to reconcile. The reconciliation isn't even about us. It's about everyone else. We're trying to heal. Everyone else should be reconciling the truths. So rescuing reconciliation isn't on us either. It's actually on everyone else. And if it's something they truly believe in, then it does require we demand different actions from those that lead us.
And that we all have to demand that, and we have to demand it every day. And I wonder, Nahid, if I can go back to you on that point. As mayor, commitment to anti-racism efforts was central in your leadership as well. And you talked just now about reconciliation. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you've seen that relationship building and some of the actions that were taken when you were mayor.
Sure. When we think about where we are now, the Wet'suwet'en example is actually a very good one. And I don't want to sound too detached or too academic about this. These are real people with real lives going on. But the fundamental challenge here is you got a conflict between colonialist structures and pre-colonial structures, but it's not clear which is correct. So in the case of the Wet'suwet'en, all 20 of the elected councils along the Coastal GasLink pipeline have consented to the pipeline, and they have an ownership stake in it. But you have some hereditary chiefs, the traditional holders of authority in the community, who do not consent. And that actually leads us to an interesting quandary, because you have the folks who belong to the nation saying, well, these are the guys I voted for on the one hand, and so they represent my voice. I didn't vote for the hereditary folks. But on the other hand, the very chief and council structure that I voted for is a colonialist Indian Act structure. So the hard part for everyone is to figure out what is it the people really want. And in this case, it's not at all clear what it is. But I think Jesse's point is a really important one. If deeper and stronger relationships are built in place first, then you have the tools to be able to deal with these issues, right? As it stands right now, I certainly have a lot of sympathy for the non-Indigenous folks trying to deal with this, but I have a contract with the guy who was elected. So where'd all this come from? And I got to get this thing built. And there were many that would argue that this is actually the best thing we can do to reduce this particular pipeline is the best thing we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because it displaces coal use throughout the world. So these are hard questions. And ultimately, I think what we need to deal with them is open hearts, but also the ability to listen to one another on both sides. One of the interesting things we've run into in the political sphere in Canada, and we see a lot of this in business, and I'm sure a lot of the Ignite conference attendees are seeing this as well, is the pendulum has swung so far, and it's a good thing it has, but there is this incredible starting point of not willing to offend. So I will not offend the Indigenous communities. I'm going to work hard not to offend the individuals that I'm dealing with. But sometimes that actually prevents us from having the real conversations. We've gotten to a world where in some cases we're almost a bit too polite. When we think about September the 30th, the National Day of Remembrance for Truth and Reconciliation, a really important day and important for us all to be there. But I really did note, as I looked around the country, and there was a famous political problem, which we don't need to get into. And part of the roots of that were, in fact, people trying to be too polite. I don't want to take my voice. It's not my place. This is time for someone else to speak. I want to seed the ground. Those are wonderful intentions. But if the intentions prevent us from having the tough conversations, that's where life gets difficult. So, I don't have any inside knowledge in this, but I can see how the Prime Minister may have said, today is not a day for my voice. It's a day for other voices. And then he did a bunch of silly things out of it. But I can see where that intention may have come from. And we need to be able to figure out how to move beyond that as we think about anti-racism. And you know what? It's easy for me to say that, but it's hard. Because with all of our big talk about making a bigger pie and growing more prosperity and opportunity and dignity for everybody, sometimes it means folks are going to give something up. And as we've learned, that can be really hard. There's a small segment of the population through this pandemic that has felt that the simple act of wearing a mask is too much of a sacrifice. It's too much of a sacrifice for other people. And so one of our biggest challenges moving into this difficult future is how do we actually agree that sometimes we do need to give something up? We need to give up some of our traditional power and privilege in order to share. And, guiding the city through that conversation has been hard. In many ways, it's been actually very easy. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the easiest decisions. So, making the gesture of renaming the Langevin Bridge to the Reconciliation Bridge, actually, that was very easy. And it was great that we did it. Now we have to go beyond that. In terms of anti-racism, actually saying, look, it's a problem that the city of Calgary as a public sector organization hires a very diverse workforce that reflects our city. But in my top 50 senior managers, there's not one visibly non-white person. That's a problem. And so coming out of last summer and this summer, it would have been easy to be a bit churlish about it and say, are you guys just figuring this out now? Did you think there's only 215 children that never came home? We've known about that for 90 years. But instead of being churlish about it, I think the important thing is to say that a broken heart can be an open heart. So as people are opening their hearts to this, it's time to start filling that conversation. So just to be very specific for a moment, at the City of Calgary, our commitment to anti-racism consists of four things. The first is a real commitment to reconciliation, if I can use that term, through the development of an Indigenous Relations Office and some other things there. The second is being an exemplar as an employer. We have 15,000 colleagues at the city, and figuring out what a true anti-racist workplace looks like in terms of hiring, promotion, and accommodation of people in our workplace. The third is a specific commitment to reform of policing and understanding how policing can work better for people from diverse communities. And I was very proud of our police chief being the first police chief, I think, anywhere in North America to acknowledge the existence of institutional racism within the structures of police. And he was very careful to say, I'm not saying police officers are racist. Maybe some of them are. What I am saying is we operate within an institution with racist roots that needs to be dealt with. And then the final is doing things like this to really have conversations about how we can lead these kind of activities throughout the community. And very briefly, I know that our audience at Ignite is a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of business people. I really want to highlight that this may sound like an academic discussion, but there are ways that you can use the business processes of good business that you're doing anyway in order to push this kind of more just society. And there's a few specific ways to do it. Number one is to make sure your business plan includes paying employees livable wages, treating employees with dignity. We often say, well, I can't afford to pay more. It's not in my business plan. But the business plan never says I can't afford to pay my rent. It's not in my business plan. I can never afford to pay my utilities. It's not in my business plan. If your business plan doesn't work without paying staff decently, then it's a bad business plan. And we got to figure out how to do that. Number two is when you finish this seminar, go back to your supply chain department, your procurement people, and ask them, how is how we buy goods and services fostering the creation of wealth-creating entrepreneurs, often first-generation people in our community? Do we require entrepreneurs to give us 20 references and be their 10th customer before we can bring them on? Or can we actually be an entrepreneur's first customer? Can we figure out ways to help these entrepreneurs grow their businesses? And the third and final one is to go back to your human resources department and ask them how they have removed those dirty words, Canadian experience, from their recruiting criteria, and how you make sure that you are being broad enough in your recruitment to hire the very best people, regardless of what they look like or how they worship or where they came from.
Naheed, thank you. I think you've given us so much to think about also in terms of how you create spaces where people feel like they see themselves in it. How, when you were talking about the too politeness of Canada, I'm reminded that we in our education work talk about the need for brave spaces rather than safe spaces. They need to be spaces to have the difficult conversations, not to shy away from those pieces. I wonder in sort of probably my final question to both of you would be to reflect a little bit on what it means to see yourselves in a space And I'm thinking a bit also about physical space. You've talked a bit about sort of our social spaces, structural spaces like the police and so forth. When we imagine our urban spaces, for example, how do we see diversity represented? And in particular, how do we see Indigenous culture, Inuit, Métis, and First Nations culture represented? One of our Global Pluralism Award finalists this year, Rose LeMay, who's Taku River Tlingit First Nation educator here in Ottawa, reflected the other day that Vancouver feels like a more welcoming space to her because of the preponderance of First Nations art in public spaces, on manhole covers and in archways as you drive along. And we see none of that, almost none of that here in Ottawa. So I wonder if you could both just say a word or two about visibility and what that does to our understanding and bridging across divides. Jesse, maybe I'll go to you first. I mean, I think with the Canada Council of the Arts, obviously, you probably have a lot of thoughts on the power of culture in this.
Sure. I mean, I think the importance of representation is not being invisible. That's what it means to be represented. And if you're not invisible, that at least means you're on the pathway to being a fully recognized human being. It may not mean you're fully there, but at least you're not. I think the danger of when you're not represented at all is that it means you're invisible, and that probably means in policy and all sorts of other places if you're not invisible in media. And I think what I would say is I think it would be really interesting to see, when it comes to place names and how we orient ourselves, maybe a return or a collaboration, given that so many of the places have been so transformed in the last 100 years, to maybe return some of the names, because it's not like many of the places in Canada didn't have names for many thousands of years. It's just they've been given new ones. And in many ways, I actually think this contributes to a sense of not necessarily knowing your place in Canada for Canadians. And it might be useful if they learn some of the languages and various places and the stories that were combined, because I think the yearning for public art, the Canada Council's new strategic plan is called Art Now More Than Ever, because I think the storytelling, the power of storytelling for us to understand each other and bridge some of these divides, and especially if it could be more present, even in a place like Toronto, I wish there was more. I wish that felt more vibrant, that people would just encounter it all the time in their daily lives. And that over time, I think the impacts could be quite profound, in that maybe we would see each other and see these places quite differently if we began sharing all the various stories, and allow some of the reorientation and the reframing, I think, to address what Naheed had mentioned before, that, we're not in competition. That is a trick. We are in community, and that is different. That because one community gains does not mean another has to lose. That is a function of colonialism. That is not a true human thing. And that while we're understanding that for some things were taken, and that requires restoration, and that doesn't mean someone will have to do without. It means that someone has been doing without for a very long time, and we need to make that whole for them. And I think storytelling is the key to unlocking that, for us to see the vision, for us to imagine a new world is so important. And I think arts are a key way to unlocking that.
Thank you, Jesse. Naheed, maybe in your role as mayor, I'm sure you saw this in the urban spaces in Calgary.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better than Jesse just did. Art and telling our stories are really incredible. Before we had this session this morning, I had to run a little errand. And running the errand took me in my car on Stony Trail to the Trans-Canada Highway to Blackfoot Trail. And, little things like that are just constant daily reminders. But I'm going to very quickly tell you about my two favorite pieces of public art in Calgary. The first is the train station near my house. It looks like an overturned canoe with a copper roof. It's got a beautiful Indigenous feeling to it. But my favorite part is that the plexiglass barriers where you wait for the train are embedded with documents, landing documents, wedding photos, Indian cards from people who live in the neighborhood. So suddenly on your daily commute, you are reminded of the variety of people that live in your neighborhood. The other is in the most magnificent building in Canada. And if you haven't come to see it yet, you got to come see it, which is Calgary Central Library, which is an extraordinary place. It's my favorite place in Calgary, precisely because libraries are a place where everyone is welcome and you don't pay a thing. And everyone comes in together. And that is an example of a building that was designed with Indigenous art from the very beginning. The very first large piece of art you see when you enter is called Education is the New Buffalo. And I won't describe it too much for you, but simply to tell you that Indigenous art can also be modern art, and it's pretty cool. But ultimately, I think reminders in our daily lives of the community that we live in a world that is becoming so much more atomized and so much more insular, are really important. And the very best way to do that is through expressions of public art, as well as through welcoming diverse people into our schools, our workplaces, and everywhere else we go.
And the power of art to open these conversations as well about what you see when you encounter these pieces is just so profound. I wanted to just, before we conclude, give both of you an opportunity to just say one or two last pieces. I think as all of our participants watching today may be feeling, what can I do? And I think, Nahid, you've given a very good list of ideas, particularly for private sector colleagues, but I wonder if there's a few last words you would want to say in terms of how we get to some of the action that we so desperately need on these issues from all people across Turtle Island. Jesse, maybe I'll ask you to maybe reflect first.
Sure. I would encourage everyone to think beyond allyship to being an accomplice. So we actually accomplish something together. And also, I think there's so much fear about doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, taking a misstep. And I don't actually think there's that much to fear. I think we've become too beholden to media systems that all they're meant to do is make us afraid of one another. And if the worst thing we can do in moments like this is nothing, when we know the status quo isn't going to work for everyone. So I would encourage everyone to take steps with the full knowledge that you're a human being. We all make mistakes. We're all going to make one probably later this afternoon. I have children, so that is inevitable. And that we know how to resolve this. We apologize. We make amends if we have to. We move forward. It's not a big, scary thing. Don't let robots on some website so affect us as human beings and how we interact as human beings. And thank you so much for this conversation. And it was great to meet Nahid and you, Meredith, even if it is in this virtual way. So miigwech so much for having me.
Thank you, Jesse. Nahid, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, thank you, Jesse, for that. That is just it. It may seem like these are insurmountable issues, but we get to live here. We get to live on this land with these people. And there's nowhere in the world I would rather be having these conversations than right here. And it's not up to, former politicians on Zoom calls to do this work. It's up to all of us. We can't rely on decision makers and politicians and big business to solve this for us. Everyday people solve this. We solve it with our everyday hands, our everyday hearts, and increasingly now, our everyday voices. So I hope that you'll come away from this a little bit inspired to think about what you can do in your own life to make this happen. As I've said many times, I don't know the solution, but I know where to find the solution. And the solution is found in the service of everyday people, in our seva. And I hope that every one of us will be compelled to continue to do seva for this community to make it even better and even more of an example for the world.
Thank you, Nahid. I think it just leaves me to say to both of you a huge thank you. Merci, changemakers. And this has been a profound conversation for me as well. And I hope for all of the participants joining us today. And so go well, go safely, and we look forward to meeting in person. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.